Kevin Bixby is an advocate for the wildlife of the state of New Mexico. And it was really important to be able to hear his perspective on how the natural resources, the wildlife, the flora, the fauna of New Mexico are not being protected and not being properly respected under the law in the state. I thought that it would be of incredible value to sit down with Kevin and learn from him about how the wildlife, the flora, the fauna of New Mexico are not being well served by the current state of the law, and how a transformational shift in environmental protection through the passage of a Green Amendment could and should make a difference for the wildlife that he loves so dearly. I hope that you'll join me and listen to Kevin and really be inspired by his view into the value and importance of wildlife protection for the people of New Mexico, for present generations, for future generations, but also for the wildlife themselves and their right to be, to live, to survive, to thrive on this earth along with we the people.
My name is Kevin Bixby. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Environmental Center.
So can you tell me how long the Southwest Environmental Center has been around and what's its mission, what's its goal?
We started at the end of the Pleistocene, and we are now just about in our 30th year. Our goal is to protect wildlife and their habitats in the Southwest.
So you, yourself, personally, how long have you been doing environmental work more broadly?
I volunteered at the Berkeley Ecology Center when I was in high school. And I've been doing it off and on ever since, but that is my career, is in wildlife conservation.
So, so you've always been wildlife, particularly, that's always been part of your passion and focus?
Yes, it has. Wildlife. I've always been drawn to animals, and particularly wild animals.
Do you have any particular personal stories of heartbreak or success or joy or anger to share?
Well, I mean, one of the highlights of my life was going to Africa and seeing all the wildlife on the in East Africa, on those the savannas of Tanzania. That was amazing. I mean, and for me, I'm acutely aware of the long history of wildlife and human interactions, and so that was sort of a bittersweet experience, because it was wonderful to see these huge congregations of animals on the grasslands of Africa, but it was sad to think that we once had an equally great abundance of wildlife on the grasslands of North America, and we wiped it out. We wiped them out.
Can you talk? What are some of the animals that we wiped out, and how do humans go about doing that?
So, just looking at the Americas, Homo sapiens, humans, arrived in the Americas maybe 15,000 years ago. That's what most people think. They came across the Bering land bridge during the Ice Age, when the sea levels were lower because of all the water being bound up in ice, and this was getting towards the end of the Ice Age. They crossed into North America and then South America, and encountered this huge world of megafauna, all sorts of big mammals that they had never seen before, but more importantly, that had never seen humans before. And these were animals that had no fear of humans, and they were easy to kill. And so as Homo sapiens, and this is what a lot of people think, although it's still debated in academic circles, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Within 1,000 years or so, more than 80% of the large species of mammals in North America, within 1,000 years of Homo sapiens arriving, had disappeared. And there is a theory that makes sense, and that is that these were naive animals. They were easy to kill. And so humans killed them. Because if you see a big giant ground sloth or mastodon, that's food for a long time for your little band of, your family and your tribe. So why not kill that animal to survive? And then just and they made their way down into South America, and just in a very short period of time, in terms of evolution and geology, we had eliminated 80% of these magnificent creatures. And we have evidence in New Mexico of humans interacting with those now extinct creatures. There's a place in southern New Mexico called White Sands National Park, and there's these extensive sand dunes of gypsum sand, and there's an ancient lake bed. And along the shores of that ancient lake bed, they have uncovered footprints of extinct giant camels and giant ground sloths interacting with humans. So you can see where they turn around and they circle each other, and I think it's the only place on the planet where you see the evidence of humans interacting with extinct Pleistocene megafauna. They also recovered the remains of a giant ground sloth down near Las Cruces. They dated to, I think, about 9,000 years ago, it had fallen down a lava tube and died. But it was at the same time that humans were occupying the area. So, the humans and those animals were here before those animals went extinct. So that happened back, 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. Fast forward to when Europeans arrived in the Americas, at the late 1400s. Then you have another period of extinctions. So we've lost these big animals, but there's still a lot of wildlife here. Other animals have taken those empty ecological niches. We wiped out the Pleistocene. The original humans to arrive were here when the giant bison disappeared, a larger species of bison that we have today. And it's thought that in the absence of those giant bison, the contemporary bison took that ecological niche on the grasslands and really increased in numbers. So then the Europeans came, and the story of European interaction with wildlife is nothing but bad for wildlife. As the Europeans expanded, the animals disappeared. And we're sort of in that period now. We have reduced the original spectacular spectacle of wildlife in North America that once was here, and reduced it to what we have now, to where we have many species that are just barely hanging on, or have disappeared from large parts of their ranges, like the gray wolf. I mean, they're holding out in pockets, and they have increased in numbers in the last 20 years, but they're still, compared to their former range in historic times, it's just a tiny fraction of how many and how widely distributed they used to be. So that's the way I view wildlife. It's not, it's a long story, and it's had this trajectory of whenever wildlife interacts with humans, wildlife loses.
Does it have to be that way here in New Mexico?
No. So, sort of the modern description of what's happening is that we are in a mass extinction crisis, where humans all around the globe are, just by our various activities, over-harvesting, clearing natural habitats for farms and pasture land or for cities, we are causing populations of animals and eventually species to disappear. It doesn't have to be that way, and there's a solution that's been proposed by scientists and advocates, and that is to set aside 50% of the Earth's land and water surfaces as nature preserves. Doesn't mean other activities can't take place, but the primary management goal for those areas should be the preservation of biological diversity. It's a very ambitious goal, but it's like climate change. It's, we've just run out of time to be less than ambitious. We have to, bold measures are the only things that are going to solve this problem. And there's an interim step to the 50%, and the timeline is 50% of the planet by the year 2050. So 30 years from now. There's an interim step, 30 by 30, which is 30% of the planet in the next 10 years. And so we can do this. I mean, if we just set our minds to it, we can do this. We got this huge awareness problem to overcome, because most people aren't really, this isn't an issue that is covered much by the media. It periodically, there's 1 million species that are endangered, and then it'll disappear from the headlines. But I think that's changing, but we have to overcome people's lack of awareness of this problem. And Senator Tom Udall, the retiring U.S. Senator from New Mexico, has sponsored a resolution in the U.S. Senate that calls for protecting 30% of the United States by 2030. So we're starting to see movement. Congresswoman Deb Haaland from New Mexico is also a sponsor in the House. But the problem, as I was mentioning earlier, is that's the direction we need to be going, and we need to be going fast. There's a tremendous urgency to this problem. The more we wait, the more we risk losing and crossing tipping points, losing species and ecosystems to where we can't return. We can't get them back. We're running out of time to do that. And yet, in New Mexico, as in most states in the United States, our state wildlife agencies and the laws and the policies are not oriented towards addressing that critical and urgent problem. They are oriented, basically looking in the rearview mirror. They're looking at the past and oriented towards serving consumptive users, hunters, anglers, and trappers. And it's not really based on modern ecological understanding of the importance of all species to ecosystems. It's not based on changing public attitudes that view animals not as resources, but as, living creatures with their own agency and own, and to which we should accord rights and treat in a just way. And they're thinking about this mass extinction crisis. And so we have this disconnect. We can make it happen, but we need to somehow get our state laws and agencies to pivot, to go from, this legacy of the past to looking forward into the future.
What do you think and maybe you've just said it in broad brush strokes, but just in case you want to add anything to, what are the most pressing issues facing New Mexico's wildlife? And maybe from this, think about the state perspective, what the state has done and or can do about it versus the federal government.
Absolutely. The state can do a lot. In fact, in the United States, states, rather than the feds, have primary jurisdiction over wildlife within their borders. So what I think New Mexico needs to do, right now, our wildlife agency, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, its authority has been delegated to it under statute by the legislature. But the legislature has only given the department the authority to manage and to regulate the take. In other words, to dictate when or if and how animals can be killed. The legislature's only given piecemeal authority to the department. It only covers about 60% of our vertebrate species and virtually none of our invertebrate species. And those invertebrates are equally important. They are the building blocks of ecosystems. And just to name one example, pollinators. I mean, the world, a lot of wild plants depend on invertebrate pollinators, insect pollinators, but so do our crops in New Mexico and everywhere. We rely on wild pollinators to pollinate our crops in order to grow them. So we need to give the department legal authority and a mandate to protect all of New Mexico's wildlife, every single species. And there's some resistance to doing that because a lot of people don't see that as being the department's role or purpose. They see it as, no, please produce our elk and deer and other things that we want to hunt, and our rainbow trout and other fish that we want to fish for. And who cares about bats or coyotes or wolves? We're just concerned with game species, and that needs to change. But a major obstacle to making that change is the fact that our game department gets 99% of its funding from, either directly or indirectly, from hunters, anglers, and trappers. That needs to change, because until we break that dependency, the game department's always going to view those groups as their primary customers. And that is so far removed from the attitude and the orientation that we need our department to have. We need our department to be New Mexico's champion for biological diversity, to step up and be the leader in protecting all of this, all the species you see, for everyone, not just for consumptive users.
So why is it not good enough to protect plants or animals, just to protect remnant populations, right? If you've got a little pocket of it over here, isn't that good enough? Why isn't that good enough? Why do we need more than a few here and a few there?
So when you say we, do you mean humans?
I mean people. Yeah. Well, if you're somebody who cares about wildlife and you want to see a species continue on into the future, right? And that wildlife population continue to live, right? Sometimes things live in small populations, sometimes they live in big populations. And so often people will say, look, the bosque here, we've protected all those cottonwoods in the bosque. That's good enough. We don't need to protect them anywhere. And there are critters there. They're enough. That's good enough because they're there. Why is it not good enough to just protect patches? Whether it's for ecology, for people, whatever you want the we to be. Why is that kind of thinking not healthy for the wildlife and not healthy for the people? Whether you're talking about morally or, otherwise.
Yeah, there's a couple ways to answer that. I would say if we start with a sort of narrowly utilitarian focus on us, meaning us human beings, and it's a little crazy, but a lot of us like to use the word us to include non-humans.
Why is that crazy?
Because there's this idea
for some
that
people it's crazy, but I don't think
there's this idea that humans are somehow better than every other form of life, and there's an estimated 8 million other forms of life, but somehow humans have gotten the idea that they are exceptional and they are better than the other 8 million. And I don't really buy that. Of course, I have my selfish species needs, but I think animals deserve to be treated with justice, and they have rights, and they have an intrinsic right to exist. So, but just going back to the utilitarian view of animals as resources to people, we benefit, like I was saying, in many different ways from wild nature. You know, every species has an ecological role in intact, functioning natural systems. And this is a natural system, this riparian ecosystem, this bosque that we see here on the banks of the Rio Grande. This is a functioning ecosystem. It is helping to capture carbon. It is helping to produce clean air. It is helping to produce clean water. It is helping to recycle nutrients and build soil. It is producing insects, which are pollinators, which directly benefit us from pollinating our crops. It is home for bats. And the bats directly help us because they go out and they consume enormous quantities of insects that we consider pests, like mosquitoes. And there's probably some plants here from which we could derive medicines that would be very beneficial to us, although we have just begun to explore the plant world for those as sources of medicines. But we have already synthesized drugs, cancer-treating drugs, from plants. So we know that there's, this is nature's pharmacy here. So there's all these innumerable ways that wild nature helps people, provides benefits for people. And the more of it we have, the more benefits we derive. Now, of course, we have to use part of the planet and alter it for our own purposes. But, you know, we should share. We should share with wild nature. We shouldn't try and convert all of it to our landscapes, our farmlands, our pasture lands, our cities. We should, we should curb ourselves and preserve the rest of it. But I also think that wild nature has a right to exist on its own account, apart from whatever benefits it provides to humans. I think that, as I say, this is home for wild animals, and wild animals deserve to have a home, and they deserve to exist.
Have you ever read the book, The Secret Life of Trees?
No, I haven't yet.
You should.
Yeah, okay. Someone recommended it.
It's really powerful about the life of trees and about their intelligence and their connectivity to one another and how they protect one another. And it's really powerful. It's really powerful.
Somebody who's a big political operative, progressive in Las Cruces, Don Kurtz, and he started this group called Progressive Voters Alliance, which we should get him on board. So the PVA used to have monthly meetings before the COVID. But one time at one of the meetings, he stood up and said, "I've been reading this book, The Secret Life of Trees." I think it was The Secret Life of Trees. And it's like, for me, a metaphor for the way we do our grassroots organizing. He talked about the root systems. And
isn't it funny? Even that got brought back to people. That book is not about the people.
Yeah.
It's about the trees. My 14-year-old, we have it on audio I do a lot of audiobooks these days because a lot of work reading. I have it on audiobook, and my 14-year-old we were listening to it driving, and then he co-opted it and just listens to it over and over while he's going to sleep at night, because it's such a beautiful, powerful realization about trees. It's just really powerful. You should go right home and buy it. Serious, Last Child in the Woods. Go right home and buy. It's like a book like that. Really powerful. We talked a lot about the Rio Grande and the stressors on it and the way people manipulate it and use it and co-opt it. I'm just wondering, thinking about the Rio Grande and other waterways in New Mexico, rivers, wetlands, the little pockets of marsh and all those other water ecosystems people don't usually think about. What? This is going to be a really hard question. But just broad brush strokes, what would it mean? what would it mean to you if to restore those water ecosystems to ecological health? A combination of what would it mean in terms of what would be necessary to make that happen? And what would it mean to the world that we live in, whether you want to talk about nature's world or people's world, or the integration between the two? See, if I gave you that question in advance to think about, like,
Yeah.
see, you'd be thinking about it all night. It's better to just get it.
Well, the first thing we need to do to restore our rivers, particularly the Rio Grande, is we have to understand that it wasn't just an inanimate thing. It was a living system. And it was the interaction of the water, the soils, the plants, the animals, all that. And it was all interconnected, and it was working in harmony. So when we came in and changed that without really thinking about how the system operated, we came in with a hubris just to remake it to serve our immediate needs without really understanding how it functioned. So we need to, first of all, we need to acknowledge that. And then, as far as how the system operates physically, we need to restore the natural flow regime of the river, which was, as I mentioned earlier, you'd have low flows in the wintertime, and then peak flows late spring, early summer with snow melt upstream, and then more low flows, and then another little peak during the summer monsoons, and then low flows, and then on and on and on. And everything that was in the ecosystem depended on that flow regime. When the river would have peak flows, it would overspill its banks, creating habitat for cottonwoods to regenerate, the conditions, and providing spawning and nursery habitat for the fishes. It would alter its course and leave behind oxbow lakes, which were important fish habitat as well. It would just sustain this whole mosaic of plant communities and dependent wildlife. And it was a very, very productive, a lot of life here, including humans. The Native Americans relied on this river as well. The problem was when we began to, first of all, settle in the floodplain, and then flooding became a problem, whereas before it was this integral ecological process, really beneficial. Then it became a problem because it became destructive of property and danger to people's lives. And so we wanted to stop the flooding, so we built dams. And that changed the natural flow pattern. So we have to restore that, and that's at the heart of these river ecosystems. And we would have to do things like unchannel the river. Rivers they're not naturally straight. And we have straightened them in order to make them more efficient delivery systems to get water from point A to point B as fast as possible. Well, nature likes to slow down water. It likes to meander, the rivers meander, and when there's a lot of water, the water spills out in the floodway and it slows down and seeps into the ground, and that restores our aquifers. And that's how you clean the water as well, through these wetlands. So we've taken that and straightened the river, and that's eliminated a lot of natural aquatic habitats. So these are things that we need to undo. But then we have our legal system that also is a problem, because we need to recognize under our system of water management that the river should have its own water rights, and that giving water to the river should be legally okay. There should be no question that that's a beneficial use.
So is there a solid effort amongst people and or government officials to preserve water equitably for people and nature?
I would say in 20 years of advocating for river restoration that we have not been able to get traction. There are devoted activists, more devoted than I am, who continue to work at it. And we do make progress here and there, but we have a lot. I think, again, the fundamental issue is the lack of awareness of how much damage we've done to these systems. I mean, in around Las Cruces, the river dries up, the Rio Grande dries up half the year, at least. And so many out of people that move to Cruces are astonished to see the Rio Grande dry. But what they don't understand is that's not a natural condition. That's an artificially manufactured condition. The way we manage the river, we have caused it to dry up. And we cause it to dry up every year. So I'd say, the biggest question is, how do we share? How do we share the water? And it's because, right now we're using the balances to use it for human needs. And there's conflicts between different human users, between farmers and cities, as far as who gets what share. But there's really, we need to share it with nature as well. And in the context of climate change and dwindling surface water supplies and a drier Southwest, it's really hard to talk about sharing with non-humans, with nature. And so, it's, and at the same time, we're not using water sustainably. I mean, we've made a lot of progress. Cities like Albuquerque and Las Cruces and El Paso have made a lot of progress in reducing per capita water use. But the bigger elephant in the room is agriculture. Agriculture uses probably 80% of the water from the river or more, and continues to plant crops that require prodigious amounts of water, like pecans. This year, I think New Mexico was the largest producer of pecans in the country, surpassed Georgia. We should not be growing a plant that is basically a water-loving riparian tree in the desert, which is what we're doing. And we're planting more every day. You go around Las Cruces and you see new orchards being planted. So there's so much work to do. I mean, if we had the will to do it, we know what to do. We know how to do it. But the state as a whole, our agencies, state engineer, the legislature, the water users, we have not come to grips with the amount of water that's available and the amount of water that we're using. We go through this exercise of water planning periodically, but we're not really looking at the truth, at reality.
So you've talked about this in bits and pieces, but I'm going to ask you this question so that you can have the opportunity to put it all in one place. So can you tell us, and this is going to come from a people perspective, right? So can you tell us why wildlife protection is important? Why should people care if wildlife don't thrive? And worse yet, if wildlife, not worse yet, equally as bad, but if wildlife go extinct, but then they never get the chance to thrive. So, what are all the things that people don't realize they get from the fact that there are these beautiful, wonderful creatures in nature, large and small, that they may or may not ever see? Why should they care? What do they get out of it? I'm serious. That's so mercenary, but it's part of our. But it doesn't have to be mercenary. It can be. The answer, I think, is very beautiful and multidimensional. And different people have different priorities, and I think there's a way that healthy wildlife touches on everybody's priority. And I'm just wondering what you think.
Well, I think if we treat wild animals as equals, as if they have their own rights to exist, it makes us better people. Because the opposite requires us to think they don't have rights because they're not as good as us. They're different than us. And really, I've seen the stats. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but we share 95% of our genes with worms, with earthworms. We're not that different from other animals. We think we are, but we're not. But when we hold to an attitude that they are inferior and therefore we can treat them badly, we can exploit them, we can dominate them, we can discard them, that's the same attitude that drives every social injustice. It's the same impetus for racism. White people thinking that they're better than colored people. The other are the colored. Or rich people thinking that they're better than poor people. Or, one religion thinking that it's better than the other. That's the root of all injustice in the world. And it's the same with nature. And I think if we are participant and culpable, accessories to that injustice, it diminishes us.
So that's a powerful moral argument. So what do you think about education? What does nature have educational value to us?
Well, sure.
I'm going to make you answer my wealth of questions. I think there's an ad nauseum long list of how nature. So education. What is that? How does nature help us there?
Well, I think we can learn a lot from nature. I think we can learn a lot from observing wild animals and plants and what can we learn? What lessons can we learn?
Yeah, just educationally. So I'm just thinking, right? I'm thinking about adults, children. I think that the kids coming out in nature, they learn so much. You learn about science. You learn about your body and balance. You learn, right? You get how to get peace and have peace of mind. That's how I think that there's incredible educational value. Like just thinking about just being here and observing, as you said. You learn. Your daughter is studying science. Yes, she's studying ecological resources, but there's a whole body of knowledge that comes from that. So, and you mentioned earlier, so I'm going to make you add it to the list now. Healthcare. What does nature do for us, or can it do for us in terms of caring for our own health?
Yeah, well, I think there's research now that shows that getting outdoors improves people's health. And not just physical health in outdoor activity, but mental health. It's good to be outdoors. Those are direct benefits. I know that I go crazy if I don't get outdoors, if I spend too much time indoors. I need nature. I need that connection. And then, there's nature's pharmacy. There are medicines that we have discovered in wild nature and plants, mostly plants, that we've used to derive medicines, drugs that help us, including Taxol. Taxol is a anti-cancer drug that comes from the Pacific yew, which is a kind of tree. So that's just one example. There's many other examples.
So do you think, thinking that, nature, there are so many facets to its wondrousness, whatever your perspective, right? Whatever your personal priority. Do you think that New Mexico's laws are up to the task of protecting New Mexico's wildlife and environments the way they're currently written and or implemented?
No, I don't. I don't. Currently there's no recognition in our state laws that all species and intact ecosystems are important and should be protected. That's just it's missing. So, a couple of manifestations of that, as I mentioned, our state wildlife agency, the Department of Game and Fish, only has authority that's been given to it by the legislature to manage and protect a little over half of our vertebrate species, even though New Mexico ranks second among the states in number of bird species, third in mammals, third in reptiles. Even though we have this incredible diversity here, most of those species, many I should say, are not protected under state law. That needs to change. As I said earlier, our system of wildlife management, the institutions, the laws, the policies are all focused on really serving the needs of, or the desires of, a small group of people that hunt, fish, or trap. And that's not most New Mexicans. Another thing, maybe even bigger issue is not the legal authority to regulate the take of animals. In other words, set laws that govern when people or if they can kill an animal for whatever purpose. But the ability to regulate activities to protect habitat. There is no state agency that has that authority either. And that's probably even a bigger issue than being able to protect individual animals, because habitat is so important for sustaining our wildlife. Now, we're fortunate we have a lot of federal public land in New Mexico where there are federal agencies, but a lot of us would argue they're not doing a very good job either of protecting the habitat on those lands. And again, what the state needs to do, and maybe a green amendment could help make this happen, is we need to adopt a goal of setting aside 50% of New Mexico by the year 2050, where biodiversity protection is the primary management goal. Doesn't mean other activities couldn't happen there. Maybe there could be hunting, fishing, maybe there could be some grazing, mining, I don't know. But the number one goal needs to be biodiversity protection. And if other activities undermine achievement of that goal, then they should not be allowed to take place.
So going along that line, so if there was a constitutional amendment that made clear to all government officials at every level of government in the state that they were the trustees of the flora, the fauna, the healthy ecological systems for the state, and were duty bound to protect all that beautiful nature for the benefit of present and future generations. That's an element of a Green Amendment. Is that something that you think would help you here in New Mexico with your, your efforts to protect the wildlife and the diversity and the healthy ecosystems?
I think that would be huge, because then we would have recourse to take agencies to court if they weren't fulfilling that duty, which we don't have right now. Right now we don't have standing to sue over most of our wildlife laws. Citizens don't. So that would be huge.
Who do you think would be against if understanding that a Green Amendment includes the right of all people to healthy ecological systems, as well as just basic things like clean water and clean air and a stable climate? Who do you think would be against that?
That's a great question.
I mean, the answer might be nobody, or they shouldn't be, but
Yeah, I think what draws me to the Green Amendment is that we would have to, everybody would have an opportunity to make their case that what they are proposing or doing is compliant with the constitutional duty to, provide a healthy environment. And so if I say, the fact that coyotes are not protected under state law is a violation of that constitutional duty, and the state Game and Fish Department says, yes, but by not protecting them, we are helping ranchers. We are giving ranchers the tools to protect their livestock better because we're reducing the number of coyotes. We'd have to make that case. We'd have a venue. We'd have an opportunity for everybody to make the case. Right now, we don't. The only opportunity we have is before the legislature. And even then, it's weighing one. If we get a law passed, it's weighing one law against another, and it wouldn't have the strength of a constitutional duty.
do you think that the people of New Mexico are ready to have a right to clean water and clean air, a stable climate, healthy environments, and to see their government duty-bound to protect the flora and the fauna and the ecological systems of the state for themselves, but also their children, their grandchildren, and all the generations yet to come?
No, we're not ready. Of course we're ready. Yes, the people of New Mexico are long past time ready for us to protect our environment. I mean, this is everything. If we don't have a healthy planet, we have nothing. Doesn't matter how good the economy is. This is the basis of a sustainable, healthy economy, is a healthy planet, which means healthy ecosystems and biological diversity.
You can't do sarcastic answers on...
You can edit it. I stopped between
I know you can. I know. I was waiting. So, before I ask you if there's anything else that you would like to say that we didn't say, I'm going to ask Bridget if, as she was just listening from her objective perch over there, if she had anything. Okay. How could protecting people's right to a healthy environment help us protect the intrinsic rights of nature and wildlife?
Well, I think that inherent in the definition of a healthy environment is the idea that we should protect and intact ecosystems with all their constituent species of wildlife and plants. That, for me, and I think is probably a scientific consensus, is included in the definition of a healthy environment. Although a healthy environment is a bit ambiguous. And it's kind of anthropocentric, healthy for whom? For people. Okay, but anyway, it is, I think you can make the case very easily that a healthy environment inherently means intact ecosystems. If they're not intact, a duty to restore them, and including all of the constituent species that make up those ecosystems and are necessary for those ecosystems to function, to be healthy and intact.
So one of the things I think you're gonna be interested in the language, so I will resend that to you later or tomorrow when I remember. But healthy environment, I mean, I think the words versions of those words are in there, but it's really a short form. Like a green amendment's the right to pure water, clean air, stable climate, and healthy environments. But there are actually other words that represent healthy environment, and I think one of them is healthy ecological systems and that kind of thing. And so, I mean, I 100% agree with you. I think it was a great question. I 100% agree with you is that one of the things that a green amendment does is ensure that we can protect all of these beautiful aspects and elements of nature that only come together when you respect and appreciate nature. And as you said, it's right to be here and the integration between all the elements and the beauty of it. So I think that that's a great question. I think that was a great answer. That it really inherently, right, you by protecting healthy nature, it means you are showing respect for nature. I like that.
Are you going to be able to edit that? Because I thought I kind of flubbed it.
We can edit the whole thing if you'd like to say it again.
I'll say it again if you...
If you want to answer it again. I was just listening to you, but if you say to yourself, you thought about it a little bit and you just want to say it again, Steve will just watch both segments and pick the best one, I'm sure. He's the producer, so I don't know what he'll do with it. But if you want to...
Yeah, let me try that again.
So how about I re-say the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hear that? I think there's a crane. Sandhill crane. Maybe we'll see it on the way out. There's going to be hundreds, thousands of them here. Yeah. They have a festival of the cranes in Socorro, which is the next town up the road, sometime in November.
Cool.
They probably won't this year, but it's a big deal. They have tours and...
So how could protecting people's right to a healthy environment help us protect the intrinsic rights of nature and wildlife?
Well, I don't think you can have a healthy environment for people without intact, functioning, natural ecosystems, wild nature, which includes all the constituent organisms, the plants and animals that make up those ecosystems. I think that's inherent in the definition of a healthy environment. Cut.